I have a little announcement to make, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker. Please be aware that there are individuals with autism and Asperger's syndrome who have attended all of our previous conferences and are attending this conference. We are extremely grateful for their participation. I would especially like to remind everyone to welcome them and respect their rights to fully participate here. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Marlo Payne Thurman. Marlo is a school psychologist and a national education consultant who obtained her specialist master's degree from the University of Utah. Marlo started her work with special needs children in 1986. Early in her career, Marlo developed a special interest in the unique needs of those individuals who were both highly intelligent and asynchronously developed. Marlo specializes in assessment, advocacy, cognitive training, sensory and behavior support, and socio-emotional coaching. She founded 2E Consulting Services, that is an expansion of her own private consulting service. Marlo has been recognized for her work by People Magazine, The Special Educator, the New York Times, and National Public Radio, and numerous local venues. She's also a mother of 2 gifted, twice exceptional young adults, whom she credits for the inspiration to much of her professional career. Marlo serves on the U.S. Autism and Asperger's Association Advisory Board and is the director for the U.S. College Autism Project, an initiative of USAAA. Please welcome Marlo Payne Thurman.
I'm going to try and use this mic. I used to always have to have a lapel, and they sometimes don't work real well either. Anyway, thank you for coming. I know you have a lot of great choices. Appreciate you being here. You've heard my professional background. I also have a personal background that brought me into the field of sensory processing. About 15 years ago, I was walking through a local hardware store, and I was crushed by an 800-pound pallet of conference tables that came off the shelf. And I had literally overnight sensory processing issues, including auditory sensitivity. I had kinesthetic issues. I had vestibular problems with my skin sensation, a lot of things. And at that time, I was working in a private practice with kids that I kind of specialize with gifted kids, but what I find is that a lot of our kids on the spectrum have pretty high innate cognitive ability. They just can't demonstrate their IQs. So I had a private practice teaching social skills to gifted kids, and almost everybody in my practice was on the spectrum. And so I kind of got into autism through the back door. But at the time of my accident, I started trying to figure out how to put all the things that the kids were doing. I tried to figure out how they functioned with their sensory systems to figure out how I could function with my new and newly impaired sensory system. So I learned a lot from the kids. And so some of the things I'll be sharing with you today are definitely from that body of work. We also opened a private school. The hardware store in which I was injured paid me a pretty decent settlement. And I took the money and built a private school, which was the Berdun School for Exceptional Children. And in that school, we had about 40 kids on the spectrum, in conjunction with some other types of learning disabilities and learning challenges. So some of the photographs and things you'll see are actually from that school. So that's a little bit of that history that's kind of interesting. We're going to talk about a couple things today. Actually, if I can make my clicker work. How does this work? There we go. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is cognition, and I want to define cognition for you as something very different than IQ, because most of us have these IQ scores on our kids that aren't great. And in fact, we know they're fairly bright, but we have these numbers that are kind of devastating at times. And what happens is when we take these tests, we're assuming that you can get your information in, you can process it, and you can get it back out in a standardized way and tell the examiner what you know. Well, in the field of autism, we know that our kids can't do the input side and the output side of that real well. I'll show you that this picture here in a second. But what we know is that our kids have genetic ability. And in fact, there's an interesting statistic that says a lot of these kids have a gifted sibling. We should have only 2% of kids on the autism spectrum have a gifted sibling, just by sheer statistics. It's not, it's about 25%. We also know that many of these kids have unmeasured abilities, especially our nonverbal kids. We see them being able to do these really phenomenal and kind of odd things, and it's unfortunate because we've called those splinter skills. Whereas in the gifted community, if you were working with gifted children, you would be calling those gifts. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that there are some unique abilities in our population and that these kids might have a higher cognitive aptitude than we give them credit for. In the least, our kids span the bell curve, okay? But what I'd like to suggest to you is that for some reason or other, that a higher number than we would expect come from families that have higher intelligence, and that a higher number than we would expect have siblings who are in the high IQ ranges. So it's genetically predicted that at least they span it, but if you can't get it in and you can't get it out, how are you going to tell the examiner what's going on in your processing? And so it's really important to take all of your test scores that you get from these experts like myself that tell you that your child has an IQ of 21 or 52 or 97. Take those with a grain of salt, okay? All right, now because these kids can't interface and they can't get their information in and they can't get their information out, we misunderstand what's really their potentials are, what they're really capable of. And very often we teach based on what they can show they know. So we teach a skill and we expect them to prove that skill before we'll teach them something new. Well, that's very unfortunate because for many of these kids, that means we're shutting down the input because we're waiting for the output. And if the output doesn't come, then we don't introduce anything new on the input side. So these kids can be actually bored. And when you see a kid who is lying on the floor of the back of the classroom stimming away, chances are good that the input is not appropriate for these kids. All right. In the field of gifted education, and by the way, that's my other area of expertise. I work with gifted and twice exceptional children. There's a guy by the name of Dabrowski, and he lived about 100 years ago, and he wrote a lot of research on gifted children, okay? And when I'm talking about gifted, I'm talking about not like, ooh, they're so special, they're gifted. I'm talking about children with measured IQs above 130. All right, that have those abstract reasoning, those higher cognitive abilities. And he talked about that in the gifted population, and this is literature that we're real clear on in the field of gifted education, that gifted children are more sensitive, they're more overexcitable, they're more intense, they have more sensory issues, they're more likely to have food allergies, yada, 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 okay? They're also more likely to have these extreme reactions. And I find that kind of interesting because when we think about that, we kind of are describing our kids. So I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, so traits, I think I said this before, but the traits that are commonly considered normal characteristics for gifted children, if I was speaking at that conference, here we're calling it a splinter skill. There we're calling it an area of giftedness. And I think that many times we kind of miss the boat in recognizing the strengths that our kids have because we're focusing very heavily on the areas of need, the areas of disability, and the areas of deficit, and we're trying to fix these kids as opposed to really taking those areas of strength and developing those out. Okay, so I would ask, as it relates to cognition, are 75% of all of our children with autism intellectually disabled, which is what the statistics should tell us, right? Or are they just not capable of performing on our tests? All right, and the second question, IQ reportedly predicts success. That's what IQ is. It's this measure of kind of your ability to perform in schools and workplaces in white middle-class America. That's really all it measures in the first place. Is there other ways that we should be measuring those abilities? Are there other things that we should be doing to tap into the cognitive abilities that these kids have? And I would suggest to you that cognitive potential and IQ are not at all the same, and that we need to be using the terminology cognitive potential with our kids with autism instead of IQ, because IQ is a kind of a meaningless thing for them. And then I would like to kind of throw this out there, and there's not many people saying this, but what if, just what if, some of our most highly intelligent children are the children who are most susceptible to autism because of those sensitivities, because of those heightened excitabilities and those overreactions to the environment and to food and to all of those things. We don't know for sure, but there's certainly some indication that there might be some relationship between high intelligence and autism potential, okay? All right, next thing I want to talk about is cognitive energy. Cognitive energy is the amount of energy you have to get something done. Okay, now we have, and you're going to see this pie again, but in our energy system, we have physical energy. And by the way, I'm not talking about magical energy. I'm talking about fuel, okay? How much do you have before you crash and burn and need to sleep or eat or do something different to refuel, okay? So when you're out of energy, cognitive, physical, and emotional are kind of the three allocations of energy, and we can think about that as a pie. And what that means is that when one of those systems is empty, you can still have energy for something else. So you can be cognitively tired from your day at work, but still have a lot of energy to go to the gym or run around or play with your friends if you're a kid. So these kids who say, Mom, I'm too tired to do my homework, but I want to play with my friends, or I want to run around, or I want to, jump up and down on the trampoline. It's a different kind of energy. And it's important that we understand this. This model comes from the brain injury literature. And what we know is that when any of these slices become depleted, meaning that we're out of physical energy, or we're out of cognitive energy, or we're out of emotional energy, then we can't borrow from one of the other slices. We have to dip into this system of reserve, okay? And reserve is there. We're biological creatures. We're designed to survive in the jungles of Africa with wild bears chasing us, all right? So what happens is when we get depleted, energetically depleted, we don't necessarily just go to sleep. We very often go into survival mode that keeps us going, and that is fueled through our adrenals, okay? Now, unfortunately, that gets also fueled, and it brings in these fight or flight reactions, these responses that use our adrenal system to get us into a fight, flight, freeze state. You've been hearing this from a lot of people in this conference, that our children with autism live in a fight, flight, freeze state. They live in this heightened state of adrenal processing. Okay, now that does some interesting things to our system. So kind of reviewing that section, cognitive energy is that innate amount of cognitive energy that's allocated. Okay, now one thing I can tell you is although cognitive energy and IQ are not the same, people with high cognitive capacity take in more sensory information. Okay, so what we know is that cognitive energy and IQ don't necessarily predict one another, but bright kids take in more information. All right, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, we talked about you can't borrow. If you're cognitively tired, you can still have energy for something else. But when you're out of energy in any one of those slices, then you have to pull from your reserves to continue to keep going. Well, we expect our kids to keep going, don't we? Okay, so and I think I said this before, the amount of cognitive capacity a person has dictates the amount of sensory information they take in. Bright people, innately cognitively higher intelligence people take in more sensory information. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And that's a little picture that kind of explains that. However, so we have this balance between cognitive energy and sensory input. Yet, for our children with autism and for kids with head injuries and kids with other kinds of learning disabilities, the executive functioning or the filtering of that information can be immature or inconsistent or not work at all, okay? So if you've got information coming at you and you don't have the maturity or the developmental levels to process or filter that information, then pretty soon everything competes for your attention. So the conversation across the hall and the dog barking and the neighbor mowing their lawn is now competing for the attention auditorily, for example, of the classroom teacher. Or visually, these are all systems that get impacted. And so what happens, we know that autism in general is a disorder of poor filtering. These kids take in a lot of information. It's not that they don't take it in. They take in too much information, and they don't know what to do with it. They can't filter it. They can't regulate it. They can't sort it and prioritize it. And so that becomes the first level of what we call executive functioning, which is the first stage at which we decide what information is important and what information is not important, okay? All right, so inaccurate sensory input, and by the way, some of our kids have that too. We call that a sensory integration disorder. Inaccurate sensory input has negative effects on the filtering and on the sensory information processing, but more importantly, inaccurate sensory inputs take up a lot of energy. If I have to pay attention to everything and my brainstem doesn't filter things out for me well, then I am exhausted by just being in this room, okay? And this was something for me that was kind of interesting because I walked out of the ER with a sensory filtering problem. I could still filter, I could still take in everything. There wasn't inaccurate signals. Things still smelled the same, tasted the same, looked the same. But the thing that was different is I couldn't decide, my brain was too tired to process and filter what's important, what is not, and it couldn't filter and regulate that. So now I was hearing the sound of high frequencies that I hadn't ever heard before. I'd heard them, but my brainstem eliminated them, okay? Or the smell of the leather furniture in my office. I'd always been there. I just didn't, it wasn't something that registered as an annoyance or a bothersome thing to me, and it wasn't something I spent any energy on. I didn't have to think about how I was going to get through my day ignoring the smell of the leather furniture in my office. All right? Okay. So, the ability to filter and sort sensory information is developed through accurate input response mechanisms. So it's really developed over time. You don't get to have developed sensory filtering skills. We learn those as babies, okay? When you think about, we would never take a baby and throw them into this noisy, chaotic environment. We protect them. We protect them from light and from sound, and we swaddle them, and we gradually introduce them to all of the sensory inputs that we have in our world. Well, for most kids, that works. For kids on the autism spectrum, that doesn't work because they don't have consistent developmental levels in that, and their sensory systems don't develop in the same way. So what happens is we have a 12-year-old who still needs to be swaddled, for example, and I don't have a big enough blanket. Actually, we do. We call them weighted blankets. But the point is, these kids develop differently, and it takes a lot of energy because they're still developmentally delayed in some of those sensory filtering mechanisms, okay? All right, so children on the autism spectrum struggle with inaccurate inputs, and that's called a sensory integration disorder, and they struggle with what we call modulation or arousal. So they get over-aroused with certain sensory stimuli, okay? And they use a lot of cognitive energy to process and filter sensory information. This is energy other kids don't have to use. Other kids don't have to spend 60% of their energy just being in the world. Our kids on the spectrum do. They have to work very, very hard to deal with this very complex sensory environment, and that takes that energy away from other things, okay? All right. So obviously this limits the energy for other tasks, and for many individuals, the tasks of language, social discourse. Think about socializing with people. It's actually one of the more exhausting things. If you're tired, you don't want to go to that cocktail party because it's real time. You have to take in all their information. You have to mentally respond and think about what you're going to say to their little response, and then you have to demonstrate what you've heard, and you have to. It's all real live. It's very challenging, and it's a multitask type situation that takes a lot of energy. Okay, so does multitasking. So does being in a new situation. When we do routines, those things take less energy. When we do new things, they take more energy. Our kids are exhausted. They are cognitively exhausted. That's why some of these things are so challenging for them. They're challenging anyway, but they're especially challenging because they don't have enough energy to do them. Okay? All right. So now we've talked a lot about sensory processing, but really haven't talked much about sensory processing, and we're going to do that next, okay? All right. So first of all, we've talked about that the sensory we haven't really talked about this, but let me introduce this topic. Our sensory system dictates our behavior. And what I want to say, how I want to explain that, is when you think about a child, especially a nonverbal child, they can't tell us what they need, they can't tell us what they know, and they can't tell us what feels good or what doesn't feel good. But if we watch them, we get a pretty good idea. So many times the sensory system drives the behavior, and the behavior then is the clue to what's going on in the sensory system. The second thing we know is when our system has too much information coming in, and this is true for every person on the planet, we get anxious, and we avoid, we withdraw, we shut down, we try to block those sensory inputs, okay? When we don't get enough coming in, then we move, we get up, we get bored, we get a cup of coffee, we go to the bathroom, we get some more input, okay? So kids who have too much information are gonna look anxious, rigid, withdrawn, they're going to shut down, and they're going to try and control the world around them to control the amount of input. Kids that have not enough are going to look inattentive, they're going to look bored, they're going to look impulsive, they're going to be out touching everything, trying to get more information in. Okay, so that's one of the ways we can tell what's really going on with these kids. Okay, while one system can be overloaded, another system can be understimulated. And I have to explain that one. I have to put the mic down to do it. So when we think about our sensory system, it's kind of helpful to think about it as a pendulum. And I've got a picture here I'll show you in a minute. We have our visual system. We have our auditory system. We have our vestibular. We have kinesthetic, proprioception. All of these systems line up, okay? Now what happens is at one moment in time, the visual system can be overstimulated at the same time the auditory system is understimulated, okay? So it's literally like this moving target, meaning that each of the systems actually moves between too much and not enough. And again, when I'm too much, I'm anxious. When I'm not enough, I'm gonna go seeking, okay? So these kids, their sensory system is in motion all the time. All right, so when neither of the states is over or understimulated, meaning the entire sensory system is in the middle, it's not over, it's not under, that's when we get calm alert. And that is really one of the only places that kids can learn. And you think about that as it relates to our children, we say, well, why aren't they learning? Well, you can't learn if you're overstimulated. You can't learn if you're understimulated. You have to be in kind of that calm alert state. And the catch is for our children with autism, they don't spend much time in the calm alert state because their sensory systems are constantly in motion. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now the calm alert state is the state where learning can occur because it is the least taxing on the energy system, meaning that we're not throwing all that energy at filtering the sensory environment. How many of you were in this room, this neuroplasticity room this morning when they had the people next door singing? Okay, think about that for just a minute. You're listening to this presentation and all of a sudden this church group next door goes into song. Think about that, how hard it was then to listen to the speaker, okay? That's what happens for children with autism every second of every hour of every day. They're constantly spending that extra energy just to filter all of that so they can pay attention to this, all right? So with that in mind, when I don't have all that sensory stuff going on, then I have more energy to take in new information, process that information, and demonstrate that information through speaking or writing or building something, okay? All right, there's that sensory pendulum I was claiming. So here's this is what it looks like, okay? And again, remembering that when I'm under-aroused, I seek. When I'm over-aroused, I avoid. Okay, so children who have more systems seeking, they're gonna look ADD. They're gonna have all those attention deficit type symptoms in addition to whatever, okay? The kids who, they're gonna fidget, they're gonna move, they're gonna self-stim, they're going to, do a lot of touching things, crawling under things, trying to grab things. Now you can stim also to block out. Stimming is actually an interesting one because you can be getting overloaded, and so you stim to give you a focus that blocks out all that other stuff out there. So stimming is a little bit tricky to pick up, but children with avoidance systems can look anxious, depressed, withdraw. They tune us out. There's one good way to filter, and it is to do 100% filtering. I can turn out everything. I can turn you off completely. And we see that with our kids. They can't pay attention to this and ignore that, so they just ignore everything. And these kids get off in their own little worlds and they tune us out. That's one way to withdraw and to filter. Okay. And then obviously some of the rigidity and compulsivity comes with that overstimulation. All right. Let's talk about fatigue, because fatigue is an interesting thing as it relates to our sensory system, our cognitive system, and behavior. All right, as biological survivors, we talked about this. We have that extra reserve. Do you remember me talking about that earlier? Okay, so when we use our reserves, it's there, it's nice, we can use it for crisis, we can use it in survival mode in demanding situations. However, because sensory processing is the largest consumer of cognitive energy, and language processing, real-time social cueing, and multitasking are next in line as consumers of our cognitive energy, our kids are tired. They dip into the reserves, but that's a very costly way to get their energy, okay? So what happens is that reserve energy is fueled through that fight, flight, or adrenal response. And the reason you see some of these things 2 or 3 times is because I talk fast. So you have to hear them 2 or 3 times to maybe pick them up. So that caused the consumption. There's that energy pie again. But what we see is that there's some very specific physiological responses that happen to the body when we are in fight, flight, freeze. When we're tired and we use our adrenals to keep going, we get adrenal fatigue, we get carbohydrate and blood sugar regulation problems, nutritional absorption goes down. Think about that. If your body has prepared you to flee from a wild animal or to fight a wild animal, you're not going to carefully and slowly digest your food. You're not going to take the time to pull your nutrients out of your food. You're going to get that food out of your stomach so you can run. Okay, so we think about that. It becomes kind of chicken and egg, but digestion, elimination, these kids don't detoxify. Their body isn't in an optimal long-term survival state. It's in this very short-term, going to survive today at all cost. Okay, and then we also get kind of histamine responses. That happens when we have these toxicities build up, but we have these allergens in the body. So these kids are more prone to these things, partly because they're in fight, flight, freeze. They're in their adrenals, and so that makes it so they're not breaking body efficiency. Their body efficiency isn't good. They're not breaking their food down properly. That causes oxidative stress, cellular respiration, all that stuff gets affected. And guess what? We see mental health disorders, and in our case, we see severity or increased severity in our autism symptoms. And you guys know this. When your kids are tired, they look worse. When they're really rested and well-fed, and they've had several good nights' sleep, they look better, and their symptoms go down, okay? All right. And by the way, this is an arousal response cycle. And this one, you can start anywhere. You can start with too much sensory information. That causes you to use a lot of energy. That energy causes you to dip into your adrenals because you're exhausted and you need extra energy to keep going. But that heightens your arousal. And think about that piece for just a minute. That's the one we really haven't talked about. Behind arousal comes when you are geared to fight a wild animal. You can't afford to be sleepy. You can't afford to be relaxed. Your breathing is going to go high and tight. You're going to pump all this blood to your limbs so that you can run or fight, okay? And think about sound sensitivity. Think about visual sensitivity. You're going to hear that tiny little crack of that twig a half mile away because you need to know if that wild animal's after you, all right? So these kids have these heightened responses, and that heightened arousal increases the amount of sensory information they take in. Well, now we're all the way back around, which now consumes energy, now keeps the adrenal cycle going, heightens the response, so it becomes this vicious cycle, and it's very hard to break. I want to give you kind of a pause for a minute, and I want you to think, I've got a little story for you. So imagine that you had a busy day at work, or busy week at work, rather, and that you have a pretty big assignment for your boss due on Friday, some kind of project that you've been working on for a while. And you about got it wrapped up, but it's Thursday, and you have kind of a last-minute thing to pull together before you turn it in on Friday. So you get that done. You're pretty wiped out, but you got one more day. You're going to get through it, okay? Go to bed, fall asleep. Deep sleep, that, oh, I'm really tired, I'm going to get a good night's sleep kind of sleep. And boom, you hear some loud crashing sound in the kitchen, all right? Rush down, and there's your cat, wide-eyed. You're like, oh, knocked a pan off. You know it's not an intruder. You know there's no one in the house. It's very obvious what has happened. Go back to bed. Do you fall right to sleep? You don't, because you've triggered your adrenals. You've turned them on, okay? And when you turn them on, they don't go off fast. It takes a long time for them to go off. So here you are. You're uncomfortable. Now the sink is dripping, and you hear it. By the way, it's been dripping for a week and a half, but you just now hear it because you have heightened sound sensitivity. You're hearing the neighbor's dog barking. Your clothes are uncomfortable. You're bedding. You're adjusting your pillows. You can't get comfortable, okay? And once you solve all the sensory issues, then your mind starts going. And you remember that you missed your Aunt Gertrude's birthday, but you've missed it every year for like 9 years. And you start thinking about, oh, how are we going to pay for college? And oh my gosh, oh, I forgot to pay that. Oh, the furnace isn't working. And your brain just starts creating all these things. And so hours and hours later, there you are, still trying to go to sleep. Even though you really do need that sleep, your body is still trying to come down from that adrenal response that woke you up. Okay, now imagine living like that all the time. That is the experience of autism. Okay? All right. So, autism then is the extreme condition of reactivity and sensitivity or mind-body asynchrony. This causes inconsistent states of sensory arousal, cognitive energy depletion, and that in turn activates the fight or flight response, and those systems negatively impact health, learning, socialization, and obviously behavior. All right, so we get into that whole chicken or egg. By the way, this is a real chicken that I hatched. You like my chicken? He's cute, huh? And that's the egg that he hatched out of. So that is a real chicken egg situation. All right. Sensory behaviors give children with autism the opportunity to feel what's good and to tell us what doesn't feel good, okay? So their behavior is a sensation that can be helpful. Everybody take just 1 minute and flap. I mean hard. Okay, now put them down. Where's your energy? You feel it? You notice your hands more than you've noticed them all day long? All right? Think about those sensory behaviors. They serve a purpose. They are meaningful, okay? The fact that they annoy you, that's just a delightful side effect. The behavior occurred because the child needed the behavior. The fact that you got annoyed was just kind of interesting. Okay, all right. Now, again, the sensory system speaks through behavior. So if you have a nonverbal kid, you can tell how their sensory system is doing by watching them. And by the way, if you can't tell by watching them, do what they do. This is what I did after my brain injury. I got up on my tippy toes and I walked on my tippy toes. Guess why kids walk on their tippy toes? Because there's a lot of pressure and sensation that you have in the feet and legs. And when your mind and your body aren't talking to each other, you can't feel your legs. You don't know where they are. So if you walk on your tippy toes, you can feel them more because the pressure is deeper, okay? All of these things that kids do, if you do them and you feel them, that gives you an idea about, oh, I get what that feels like. That might mean this. And that can be helpful for us as parents working with these kids or as educators even. Okay. Alrighty, so the ability to filter and sort sensory stimulation is learned. The best way we can speed up that learning curve, if possible, is to alter the sensory environment and offer safe sensory experiences. Why is safety important? We don't want to learn in our adrenals. That's not healthy learning. We're learning how to fight, how to run, or how to freeze. Hold really still so maybe we won't get eaten. That's not healthy. That's not a healthy learning place. These kids need safe environments. And so many times when we do OT to them, occupational therapy, when we do it to them, it doesn't feel safe to them at all. So we have to be pretty careful. Okay, so an individual, again, must have enough input to turn it on cognitively. They have to have that balance coming in. Too much causes the anxiety and fatigue. Too little causes boredom and attention. Okay, so we talked about this one again. I'll let you read that one. and I'll breathe. Okay. This is a learning model that I put together that kind of puts these different pieces together. So when we think about learning, and we're going to move into some sensory learning stuff next. When we think about learning, we have that input, that processing, and that output. We have that balance between the cognitive energy and the sensory input, and we have that big, huge filtering problem in the middle. All of those things are part of our issue that we deal with. So because sensory behaviors serve a sensory need, they are internally driven. That means we can do ABA therapy until we are green, but if the sensory behavior is needful from the inside out, we're not going to change it. We're just going to substitute it with something else that fills that same need, okay? So yes, we can control behavior, but the need doesn't go away. All right, so attending to both the physical health issues, and by the way, think about, we've talked about, some of the sensory issues, but we haven't talked about, what if your tummy hurts all the time? That's a sensory behavior. What if your body temperature is off all the time and you're either hot or cold? Okay, those things take energy too. So when we think about antecedent control in our behavior planning, we have to recognize that physical symptoms, sensory systems, all of those things have to underlie any good behavioral planning. We can't just say, oh, he does the behavior because he's avoiding. Why is he avoiding? What is he avoiding? Okay? All righty. Now we're going to talk about the specifics. All right, this is the visual system. And this is going to be a little hard with a mic. This is why I usually have a lapel. Kids who are visually overstimulated. Okay, these are the kids who hide under the desk. They want to wear something over their eyes. They like their hair hanging. They like hoodies. They like to be tucked in, so you'll be 95 degrees outside, and they've got this hoodie wrapped around their face. Okay, these are kids who need to be protected from visual stimulation. So they need to be, and I'm not going to read all these to you, I'm just going to go through some highlights, okay? But the main point is they need to be protected visually. They need to be seated away from open doorways and hallways. I've been into so many classrooms, public school classrooms, where you walk in there and there's stuff hanging off the ceiling, like those mobile things, and all of a sudden you've got these kids who are just like, it's very overwhelming for some of our kids, and especially in the peripheral. And think about that. If you're in a fight, flight, freeze state, your peripheral vision is going to be more heightened than your frontal vision because you need to see that bear that's coming after you. So you're going to be very observant to those little bits of motion in your peripheral field. Well, our kids tend to be that way. They tend to, Temple talks about that whole seeing things from the corner of your eye, like you're an animal out in the middle of a field. Well, that is visual overstimulation, okay? For kids that are understimulated, these are the kids who walk into a room and they check out everything. They're under the table, they're checking out the light fixtures, they know where every light socket is and every electrical outlet. They can take in everything, and they really are, they might even be stimming. They might be watching things, watching fans move or washing machines spin, or they might be looking out of the corner of their eye and watching the flagpoles go by on the road. Those are kids who are seeking stimulation. Now, the thing we don't want to do is give them so much that we overstimulate them. So we want to give them calm visual stimulation. So these are the kids who love lava lamps and fish tanks, something slow moving to watch. Okay, they can sit under a mobile as long as it's not going boop, 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 boop too fast. These are kids who need visual cues. They need to be sitting in front of the room that's got like some pictures on the wall, or they need cue cards on their desk, things to look at, things to direct them. These are the kids who need to doodle. They can actually remember a lot from just doodling little pictures while they're listening. They also, organizationally, sometimes need those wheel and spokes, so you're actually drawing all their ideas. So something like the inspiration software to help them organize their thoughts. And again, this would be some of the higher functioning kids that could use that inspiration software. Here's some examples of kids using vision therapy or red-green. A lot of these kids do have developmental optometry issues. We've had 3 different developmental optometrists here tell us that our kids struggle with processing some of the visual information, and they use their eyes a little bit differently. So the ocular motor skills can be trained, and some of these kids need that. This is a little girl who this is actually pictures from our school, and this is a little girl who got really visually overstimulated. So these are little tents. And by the way, you'd say, oh, well, my classroom can't tolerate that. Guess what? They can. and they should. These are $4 at Walmart, and you can fold them up and put them behind the teacher's desk so they're out of the way. Now, one of the things that happens is teachers will say, well, if I have a tent in my room, everybody will want to work in the tent. And that's true for about 3 days. So you have 3 days where everybody gets to work in the tent, and what you find is if tents are a common part of the room, the kids who need them will be in them. The kids who don't need them won't really want to work on them because they're not as comfortable sitting on the floor as they are in a desk. So this is one of the things that we can use in a classroom. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Uh-huh. Just like to be away from people. Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh. And these are things that we should be putting, and these are things that can be put into 504s. And by the way, we've actually got the science fair display boards, those tall ones. They make really good dividers if you cut them off, cut them in half. So they're like head high. They're not this giant tall thing. And those that can actually just sit around the desk, and kids can put them around themselves while they're working so they're not so visually distracted. And again, remember that it's almost the peripheral stuff more than the frontal stuff that can be a problem. So thinking about ways to block that peripheral stuff. Okay, auditory. The kids who are sensitive cover their ears. They complain of loud noises. They avoid situations where it's noisy, and you see them behaviorally melt down when it's noisy, okay? The kids who are understimulated, they make their own noise. They hum, they clap, they make little sounds, they tap, 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 okay? And by the way, you can tell which direction kids are going to. Remember, it's not that they just do one or the other. Remember, they can go both ways in 30-minute increments, okay? So it gets a little tricky, but when a child is overstimulated, we want to protect them. These are the kids who can benefit from seating away from the noisy part of the classroom. These are the kids who tend to be pretty sensitive to high and low frequencies. So the frequency of the computer, the lighting in the room can be a problem for them, particularly fans, the carpet cleaner. These are the kids you want to warn them if you're going to do a fire drill. Okay, these kids, you don't want to surprise them with that kind of stuff. There's also some listening therapies that work. There's some filters. They're called musician's ear filters, and they block out certain frequencies of sound, and you can use those. And then really just recognizing that these kids can't be in the lunchroom with 57 other classes. They can't handle that kind of noise. So these are kids who need to be in a quiet place if they're going to eat, because they won't eat lunch if they're in a really noisy place. Okay? All right, the kids who are understimulated, these are kids, you can actually give them an iPod or some kind of music selection, and the rule of thumb is that if it doesn't have words, it won't compete. And when you think about that, when we listen to a music selection that's repetitive and predictable, the brain doesn't really process it after the first few times, but it does a nice job of giving some auditory stimulation and or blocking out everything else. So you see these kids who want to watch the same movie like 8,000 times at night. The reason they do that is because it's predictable and they don't really have to watch it, but it drowns out everything else. Okay? All right, so these are kids that need some stimulation. You also sometimes have to prompt them to let them know how their sounds can be bothersome to other people. So you can actually record those sounds and play them back to them. Some of these kids like hearing their own noise. So you can actually, if you've got a noisy kid, you can actually record them making noise and then let them listen to their own noise on an iPod. And that serves the purpose of them making noise without them having to make noise for the rest of you. Okay? All right. These kids also need noise breaks. They need a moment to go outside and scream and yell and shout and be really, really loud. And then a lot of support around those things. Another thing that can help with that is like classroom fountains and just those background noises that are in kind of a low frequency. You don't want to go high frequency. The other thing you can do is music that has kind of mid-range frequency, so like acoustic guitar type stuff can be helpful. Okay, these are the musician's ear filters that we talked about. They block out certain frequencies of sound, and for some of our kids, these are pretty helpful. We also do listening therapy. Some of these kids will wear headphones. Now, if you put them in headphones, you have to be careful because they will never want to take them off. We had 46 pairs of headphones stolen from our school because the kids got used to wearing them and they wanted to wear them all the time. So you have to make sure that they're taking headphones off during instructional time, but then they're allowed to wear headphones during work time. All right, kinesthetically, the kids who are overstimulated, sensitive to fabrics, clothes, textures, touch, they don't want to be touched, they can't be in the line without melting down. These are all kids that have kinesthetic sensitivity. The kids who are understimulated, these, I hate to say this, but these are the boogery kids. These are the kids who always have little gooey things or little muddy things or little strings or little hairs. They are always playing with stuff in their fingers, and they've always got some little gummy, gooey thing stuck to them, it seems like. All right, the kids who, that was kind of funny, huh? All right, the kids who are overstimulated, we really have to respect their clothing preferences, and that's tricky because we'd say, oh no, we want them to broaden their repertoire of clothing. However, do we want them spending all of their energy at school processing the texture of their pants? That's kind of a waste of energy, isn't it? So thinking about respecting those clothing preferences, we can offer warm, smooth, small objects, worry stones. Obviously, you don't want choking hazards for young kids, but things that they can touch and feel that are calming and soothing to the skin. These kids are kind of funny about fabrics, so really recognizing fabrics, and what we find is that the natural fabrics can be helpful. These are kids who love the jersey sheets, those jersey t-shirt sheets. I mean, they love them, and they will actually sleep better because they have jersey t-shirt sheets. Okay, these are kids who also need some help with learning body space and helping other kids to recognize these are kids that got to have their space or you might get hit or you're going to have a child that melts down on you. Okay, these are kids who can also do hand wringing or self-brushing, but you don't want to ever brush a super sensitive kid unless it's part of a very specific program, because otherwise you're going to use up all their energy and you're going to teach them that brushing is painful. So you have to be a little careful with some of these brushing protocols. Okay, these are the kids who also have to wear hand socks. I want to show you. These are hand socks, arm socks. Okay, I still have nerve damage that prevents me from being able to tolerate the sensation of any fabric rubbing against my arms. All right, some of these kids have that. So compression, this is a pair of old socks that got cut off. And what that does is it gives constant pressure and sensation, so I'm not feeling the motion of my shirt going up and down my arm, okay? All right, the understimulated kids, these kids need stuff to touch. They need texture bags or goodie, those little bags that you can carry on your pants that have little stuff in them for them to play with. They need to hold something, have something in their hand, or they're not going to be able to listen or concentrate or pay attention. I'll show you some pictures of these. So this is another hand sock. This is a little girl who had so much sensitivity on her hands that she couldn't tolerate the sensation of the paper against her skin. So she actually needed to have some protection for her hands so that she could manipulate a pencil, okay? A lot of these kids want their head covered. And by the way, we have all these zero tolerance policies because of the gang stuff around wearing hats, but these are things that we can talk to the 504 person and get into the IEP as long as they don't have logos on them. And what we find is that we can get them in without the logos. If they have logos on them, then it becomes kind of gang warfare type stuff. But what we find is that a lot of these kids do need to have their head covered or their head protected. And that's when we think about any of us, when we've had any kind of assault to our body, the thing we want to protect more than anything is our head. And so it's not really surprising that our kids want to wear hats. Okay, this is a kid who was doing self-brushing. And this is a kid who likes a lot of sensory stimulation, so much so that she really likes those gummy, gooey things. And so we are allowing, this is an art project. She's painting with her feet. Okay. All right, proprioception. Does everybody know what proprioception is? If you don't, raise your hand. A few people. Okay, let me go ahead and define it. Proprioception is the sensation of weight and pressure against the joints and muscles of the body, and it's brought on by that sensation of gravity. So it's how you feel in those joints and muscles when you jump, when you sit, when you move. Okay, a lot of our kids have problems in proprioception. And by the way, it's not surprising if you can't sit on a chair if you can't feel your butt? Now, one of the things that happened to me after my accident is I literally felt like I wasn't sitting on my own behind. I was sitting on something else. I didn't have the same weight and pressure. My sensation that way really changed, and it really threw me off. It threw me off for balance. It threw me off from being able to sit upright on a chair. And I mean, at this point, I was a grown woman. I was in my 30s. I'd had 2 babies. I mean, I was pretty functioning in the proprioception realm. But what I found is that I had a really hard time just sitting in a chair because I felt like I was falling out of the chair all the time because I didn't have that good sensation of weight, pressure, and gravity. Okay, so now this one is tricky to figure out whether they're seeking or avoiding because the behaviors are almost always the same. But these are your aggressive kids. These are your teeth grinders. These are the kids who pop their knuckles. They bang their heads. They push, pull, and drag things. Okay? These are also the kids who can't sit in a chair. They fall out of a chair. You'll be walking through the mall and they're right behind you, and then you look back and they'll just be like, You'll be dragging them by the foot through the mall because you can't get them up. Okay, it's like they're on or they're off. There's nothing in between. And when they're on, they look really rigid. They look really uncomfortable. And when they're off, they just are floppy. They look like rag dolls. Okay, so here's some things that can help. These are the kids who do need to push, pull, stretch. TheraBands can be helpful. These are the kids who love weight training, by the way. They really could use some body work, some deep, deep pressure type stuff. Ankle weights can be helpful. And again, some of these things you want to work with an occupational therapist. You don't want to put a kid in ankle weights and leave them in them all the time, okay? But ankle weights can help these kids find their feet. Hand weights, arm weights, weighted vests, weighted jackets, those kinds of things can be really helpful. And again, don't leave them in them all the time because then that becomes the new norm, okay? All right, so really thinking about ways to help. Now, we jumped through 2 indoor trampolines at my school. They have, and I'm not talking about the little tiny ones. Little tiny ones don't give you any sensation. It's like blink, 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 blink. I'm talking about the big trampoline that goes doo-doo, doo-doo. You don't want these kids very far off the ground, take my word. But we actually had the 8-foot indoor trampolines with soft sides on them, and these kids actually would, when they needed to take a break, go jump on that trampoline, and that would help them regulate. Okay, these kids can also benefit from the sit discs and the therapy balls, although unfortunately, one of the only proprioceptive supports we get in the classroom is a sit disc. And so if you have proprioceptive issues, you get this little squishy ball that you're supposed to sit on, and if you like it, great, and if you don't, too bad, that's all we're doing. So really recognizing that sit discs are not the end all be all. I'm close. She's giving me my 5 minutes. All right, vestibular. These are the kids who have balance issues. They're easy car sick, or they are jumping off stuff. They're jumping, rolling, tumbling, spinning, rocking. Okay, these are some of the things that can help with them. One of the things to really pay attention to, you can almost always tell vestibular because these are the kids who sit with their knees in a W. Okay, that's vestibular. All right, so things that can help. Make sure that their balance is good. Give them some balance training. These kids can be on rocker boards. They can also use spinners. Here's a weighted vest. This can help with, by the way, the reason these are together is because proprioceptive and vestibular, we treat it kind of the same way. So the weighted vests, weighted hand stuff, weighted ankle, most of these things can be bought like at Kmart, Walmart, Target, any of those local kind of places have these things. Now, this is actually one that we built. It's a weighted snake. It's got about 15 pounds in it, and we had kids who could not tolerate being touched. However, with that thing on, it calmed them down, and they could go to any class. This is the trampoline I was telling you about. We actually had a kick bag in the school, and some of our kids really needed that strong, deep sensation, especially when they were angry or frustrated. This is a therapy band, sit disc. One of the things that I liked about this one is it has that little support underneath it. See, these balls that roll around aren't good. And by the way, a lot of the balls now have weighted sand in the bottom of them so they don't roll, and that's the ones you want to get. This is a foot support. Think about a bar stool. How many of you are comfortable in a bar stool for all day? You're hanging. All right, these kids need to have their feet stable. Therapy balls. Okay, this is a body sock. So this is a kid who couldn't calm down until you completely enclose him. This is just stretchy fabric that was sewed up in a little tube, and he could crawl up in there and get inside and calm his system down. This is a rocker board. Here's a spinner. Some of these kids need to spin. Spinning is interesting because you spin until you're done. And as soon as you're done, you never need to spin again. So these kids who are spinners, if you put them on a spin board, they will spin themselves out, and then they will be done, and they'll never spin again. All right. Chewing, slurping, swallowing, gulping, hot, cold, digestion, elimination. Okay? These are the kids who have a lot of that, all those kind of slurping, swallowing sounds. There's a few things that you can kind of pay attention to with those. Sour candies are good. Really, chewing tubes, you can buy those at a hardware store. You want to boil them in water. You want to make sure that you're getting, or you can buy surgical tubing. We actually boil ours in Jello water, and that's the way the kids will chew on them. Otherwise, they taste kind of medical and weird. Then in terms of the medial is that whole sensation from the time you swallow it till the time it comes out the other end. So it's all the digestion elimination stuff. And you really have to monitor these kids. These are the kids who have a lot of hands and pants behavior, a lot of toileting issues. But you also want to pay attention because these are also the same kids that have bladder infections, and they can have, problems with stools and all that kind of stuff. So you want to monitor that pretty carefully. All right, and there's a chew tube. All right, conclusions. See, I told you I was close. She's surprised at how fast I can talk. All right, so measured IQ and cognitive potential are not the same for individuals with autism. Our kids have higher cognitive potential than our IQs measure. Children with autism have high cognitive aptitude in spite of lower IQ scores. Shoot for the top. Don't assume the low, okay? That doesn't mean you have a gifted child, but you might. And what if you do? All right? Low cognitive energy leads to heightened sensory sensitivity, physiological arousal, and fight or flight reactions. Okay, and we talked a lot about how the extra sensory processing consumes a lot of that energy. Now, the arousal, which is that heightened sensitivity, contributes to the behavior, poor social skills, physical illness, and ultimately additional mental health disorders. So you get these kids diagnosed with autism and something else. Okay? And then the calm alert state is the most efficient for new learning. Effective therapies and appropriate teaching methods and useful behavior interventions for children with autism address innate cognitive potentials. That means we shoot for the top, we attend to the sensory needs, we manage their fatigue. If they're tired, keep them home. Let them have a day to rest. Let them sleep when they can, because if they get too tired, they won't be able to sleep. All right? We manage their stimulation, their overall physical and emotional wellness, and all of that should be part of our planning. All right, and that is the end of my session. I want to explain this slide for you. This is a little boy that was referred to me as the most difficult and challenging kid in my entire practice of 20,000 children. This little boy drew this for me on his last day at our school. And what he's got, if you look here, it's like some kind of time dilation sequence on his little blackboard, and he's got the little logo here, and that's his little chest logo says Burdoon, which is the name of our school. And if you read the bottom, it says, "I'm not strange, I'm rare." And I think that's a good place for us to leave. Thank you.